Richard Robinson sat on his porch, the familiar creak of the rocking chair a soothing soundtrack to his peaceful evening. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden hue over the neighborhood. At 54, Richard had built a life of comfort and stability. He relished the simple pleasures: a cup of coffee in the morning, tending to his garden, and sharing quiet dinners with his wife, Rebecca. They had been married for over 30 years, and their bond had weathered many storms. Richard's days were a blend of routine and contentment. He worked as a financial advisor, a career that afforded him a steady income and the respect of his peers. His colleagues admired his steady hand and calm demeanor, qualities that also made him a beloved figure in the community. Richard enjoyed his routine, finding satisfaction in the predictability of his life. His evenings were reserved for leisurely activities, such as reading a good book or watching his favorite TV shows. Rebecca, too, had been a source of joy and stability. They had raised two wonderful children who had now embarked on their own journeys. With the nest empty, Richard looked forward to spending more quality time with his wife, rekindling the romance that had been put on hold during the bustling years of parenthood. They took walks together in the park, attended local events, and occasionally hosted friends for dinner. Life was good, and Richard felt blessed. However, recently, Richard noticed subtle changes in Rebecca's behavior. At first, he dismissed them as trivial. She seemed more distracted, often lost in thought. Her phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter, was now always within her reach. Richard's curiosity was piqued, but he brushed aside his suspicions. After all, they had been together for so long. Trust was the cornerstone of their marriage. Rebecca had started going out more frequently, citing errands and meetings with friends. Richard didn't mind. He believed in giving each other space. But he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. One evening, as he waited for her to return, he found himself staring at the clock, the minutes stretching into hours. When she finally walked in, her explanation felt rehearsed, her smile strained. Richard pushed the doubts aside, convincing himself that he was overreacting. On weekends, they used to enjoy leisurely breakfasts together, discussing everything from the news to their plans for the day. Lately, Rebecca seemed preoccupied, her mind elsewhere. Richard found himself eating alone more often than not. He tried to engage her in conversation, but her responses were curt, her laughter forced. The intimacy they once shared was slipping away, replaced by an invisible barrier that Richard couldn't breach. One afternoon, Richard decided to surprise Rebecca by joining her on one of her supposed errands. He arrived at the local cafe, expecting to find her with her friends. Instead, he saw her seated at a corner table, deep in conversation with a man he didn't recognize. Richard's heart sank as he watched them laugh and share a moment of closeness that had become rare in their own relationship. He felt a pang of jealousy, but more than that, a sense of betrayal. That evening, Richard confronted Rebecca gently, asking her about her day. She was evasive, her answers vague. Richard's suspicions grew, but he didn't press further. He didn't want to accuse her without evidence, nor did he want to believe that the woman he loved could deceive him. As the days passed, Richard's mind was a battlefield of emotions. He tried to focus on his work, but the nagging doubts followed him everywhere. He found himself replaying moments in his head, searching for clues he might have missed. He wanted to trust Rebecca, but the changes in her behavior were undeniable. One night, as he lay in bed beside her, Richard stared at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. The calm before the storm had been shattered, and he knew that his life was about to change. He couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Richard realized that he had to confront the situation, to seek the truth no matter how painful it might be. The storm was coming, and he had to be prepared to face it. Richard's idyllic life was on the brink of upheaval. The simple pleasures that once brought him joy were now overshadowed by a growing sense of dread. As he closed his eyes, he resolved to uncover the truth, to confront the changes that threatened to unravel his world. The calm before the storm was over, and Richard braced himself for what lay ahead. Richard Robinson sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the familiar surroundings. Yet, the warmth of his home felt distant, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Rebecca had been acting strangely for weeks, and Richard couldn't ignore it any longer. It started with the late nights. Rebecca, who had always been home by dinner, began staying out later and later. At first, she claimed it was work-related. Her company had taken on new projects, and she needed to stay late to meet deadlines. Richard accepted this explanation without question. He trusted Rebecca implicitly. Their marriage was built on a foundation of mutual respect and faith. But then, the phone calls began. Rebecca would excuse herself from the room whenever her phone rang, speaking in hushed tones behind closed doors. When Richard asked about it, she brushed it off, saying it was just work or a friend in need. Still, the secrecy gnawed at him. One evening, as Richard sat in the living room reading, Rebecca's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She quickly grabbed it, glancing at the screen before heading to the backyard. Richard watched her through the window, her silhouette illuminated by the patio light. She seemed animated, her gestures more expressive than usual. When she returned, her smile was forced, and she avoided his eyes. "Who was that?" Richard asked casually, trying to mask his concern. "Oh, just Susan from work," Rebecca replied, her tone light. "She's going through a tough time with her husband." Richard nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He wanted to believe her, to trust that their bond was unbreakable. Yet, the doubts lingered, creeping into his thoughts at unexpected moments. Their once lively conversations grew sparse. Rebecca's responses became monosyllabic, her laughter rare. Richard found himself reaching out to her, trying to bridge the growing chasm between them. He suggested date nights, weekend getaways, anything to rekindle the spark that had defined their relationship for so many years. Rebecca agreed, but her enthusiasm seemed forced, her mind elsewhere. One Saturday afternoon, Richard decided to surprise Rebecca at her office. He brought lunch, hoping to share a meal and perhaps catch a glimpse of the stress she had been under. When he arrived, he was greeted by an empty desk. A coworker informed him that Rebecca had left hours ago, mentioning she had personal errands to run. Richard's heart sank. He left the office, lunch untouched, and drove aimlessly around the city, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and suspicion. That evening, Rebecca returned home with a shopping bag in hand, a cheerful smile on her face. Richard watched her carefully, searching for any sign of deceit. "How was your day?" he asked, trying to keep his tone even. "Busy," Rebecca replied, setting the bag on the counter. "I had to run a few errands after work." Richard's mind raced. Should he confront her? Demand to know where she had been? He decided against it, choosing instead to observe and gather more information. Accusing her without proof felt wrong, and he didn't want to risk damaging their relationship further if his suspicions were unfounded. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between them grew. Richard's unease deepened, but he struggled to find a way to address it. He confided in his closest friend, Tom, over a round of golf one sunny afternoon. "Have you talked to her about it?" Tom asked, eyeing Richard with concern. "I've tried," Richard admitted, "but she always has an excuse. I don't want to accuse her of something if there's a reasonable explanation." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe you should consider seeing a marriage counselor. Sometimes, an outside perspective can help." Richard considered Tom's suggestion. He had always believed in the sanctity of marriage, the idea that any problem could be resolved with communication and effort. The thought of involving a third party felt like an admission of failure, but he was running out of options. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Richard finally broached the subject. "Rebecca, I've noticed you've been distant lately. Is everything okay?" Rebecca looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Of course everything's fine. Why do you ask?" Richard hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's just that you've been working late, taking a lot of phone calls in private. I can't help but feel like something's bothering you." Rebecca sighed, setting down her fork. "Richard, I promise there's nothing to worry about. Work has just been really demanding lately. I'm sorry if I've been neglecting you." Richard wanted to believe her, to accept her explanation at face value. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it continued to grow, feeding on every secretive glance, every unexplained absence. As he lay in bed that night, Richard stared at the ceiling, his mind a tangled mess of suspicion and hope. He had to find a way to address his concerns, to bridge the gap that was widening between them. The calm before the storm was over, and Richard knew that he had to act before it was too late. The sanctity of their marriage depended on it. Richard Robinson was in the middle of a meeting, discussing investment strategies with a longtime client, when his phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen, expecting a routine call, but the number was unfamiliar. Excusing himself, he stepped out of the conference room and answered. "Hello?" he said, his voice calm and professional. "Is this Richard?" a voice asked, dripping with arrogance. "Yes, who is this?" Richard replied, a hint of annoyance creeping in. "This is Scott," the voice continued, smug and mocking. "I'm the one who's been spending time with your wife." Richard felt a cold chill run down his spine. His grip tightened on the phone as he struggled to process the words. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his heart pounding. "Your wife, Rebecca," Scott said, relishing each word. "She's been with me. She's amazing, you know? The way she handles me, well, let's just say she's my property now." The crude and taunting words hit Richard like a sledgehammer. His world spun as the implications of the call sank in. Rebecca, the woman he had loved and trusted for over 30 years, was being claimed by another man. He felt a mix of rage, humiliation, and deep sorrow. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Richard growled, his voice shaking with emotion. "I'm just the guy who's taking care of what you couldn't," Scott sneered. "You should do yourself a favor and get a divorce. She doesn't want you anymore. She's mine." The call ended abruptly, leaving Richard standing in the hallway, stunned and speechless. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he tried to make sense of the situation. Rebecca's late nights, the secretive phone calls, her growing distance, it all made sense now. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, revealing a picture he had desperately hoped was not true. Richard returned to his office, his mind racing. He couldn't concentrate on his work. The revelation consumed him. He needed to confront Rebecca, to hear the truth from her own lips. Without a word to his colleagues, he grabbed his coat and left the office, his thoughts a chaotic whirl of anger and heartbreak. The drive home felt like an eternity. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He replayed the call in his mind, each word a dagger to his heart. How could Rebecca do this to him? To their family? He thought of the years they had spent together, the memories they had built. It all seemed like a cruel joke now. When he finally pulled into the driveway, he noticed that Rebecca's car was not there. A small mercy, he thought. It would give him time to collect himself, to prepare for the confrontation. He entered the house, the familiar surroundings now tainted by betrayal. His heart ached as he looked around, memories of happier times flooding his mind. In the living room, Richard sat down heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. He tried to calm himself, to think rationally, but the pain was too raw, too immediate. He felt a deep sense of loss, as if a part of him had been ripped away. The life he had known was over, shattered by a single phone call. As he sat there, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, hoping for a message from Rebecca, an explanation, anything that could make sense of this nightmare. But it was a text from Scott, another taunt. "By the way, I hope you don't mind, but Rebecca and I are planning a weekend getaway. You should find a way to keep yourself busy." Richard's anger flared, hot and uncontrollable. He stood up abruptly, knocking over a lamp in his fury. He couldn't sit idly by and let this man destroy his life. He had to take action, to confront Rebecca and demand answers. Determined, Richard began pacing the room, his mind racing with plans. He would gather evidence, confront Rebecca with the truth, and then what? He wasn't sure. The future seemed uncertain, a dark abyss of possibilities. But one thing was clear. He couldn't let this betrayal go unanswered. Hours passed, each minute stretching painfully. Finally, he heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. His heart pounded as he braced himself for the confrontation. The door opened, and Rebecca walked in, her expression casual until she saw Richard's face. "Richard, what are you doing home so early?" she asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. Richard took a deep breath, his emotions swirling. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "All right. What is it?" Richard gestured to the couch. "Sit down." As Rebecca sat, Richard stood before her, the weight of the devastating call bearing down on him. "I got a call today," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "from a man named Scott. He claims he's been spending time with you, that you're his property now." Rebecca's face went pale, her eyes widening in shock. "Richard, don't," Richard interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't lie to me. I need to know the truth, Rebecca. I deserve that much." The room fell silent, the air heavy with tension. Richard waited, his heart aching, as Rebecca struggled to find the words. The confrontation had begun, and there was no turning back. Richard drove home with a heavy heart, his mind reeling from the call that had shattered his world. He needed to confront Rebecca and understand the full extent of her betrayal. As he turned the corner onto his street, he noticed something unusual. His front yard was strewn with clothes, shoes, and personal belongings. The sight was jarring, a chaotic mess that stood in stark contrast to the tidy lawn he meticulously maintained. He pulled into the driveway, his heart pounding. Rebecca's belongings were scattered everywhere. Dresses hung from tree branches, shoes lay in the grass, and boxes of personal items were tipped over. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he surveyed the scene. It was as if someone had ransacked their home and thrown out every trace of Rebecca. Among the chaos, Richard's eyes were drawn to a large, black duffel bag sitting on the front steps. It was labeled with a handwritten tag, "For my lovely wife." The sight of the bag filled him with a mixture of dread and curiosity. He approached it cautiously, his hands trembling as he unzipped it. Inside, Richard found a collection of items that told the story of Rebecca's infidelity. The first thing he pulled out was a stack of photographs. His heart sank as he flipped through them. There was Rebecca, smiling and laughing, wrapped in the arms of a man Richard recognized from the office Christmas party. The same man who had called him earlier that day, Scott. Each photograph was a knife to Richard's heart. He saw Rebecca and Scott in various settings, at a beach, in a cozy restaurant, and even in what appeared to be a hotel room. The images were intimate, filled with a happiness that Richard hadn't seen in Rebecca for a long time. Next, Richard found a bundle of love letters, tied together with a red ribbon. He hesitated before unfolding the first one, bracing himself for the painful words he was about to read. The letters were filled with declarations of love and passion, detailing the secret meetings and stolen moments that Rebecca and Scott had shared. They spoke of plans for the future, dreams that excluded Richard entirely. As he read, Richard felt a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal. The woman he had loved for over 30 years had been living a double life. He had trusted her, believed in their marriage, and now it all felt like a lie. The love letters were a stark reminder of the emotional distance that had grown between them, a gap that had been filled by another man. At the bottom of the bag, Richard found a journal. It was Rebecca's, filled with entries that chronicled her affair. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it, unable to stop himself. The entries were raw and honest, revealing Rebecca's feelings of dissatisfaction, her longing for excitement, and her justifications for betraying Richard. In one entry, Rebecca wrote, "Richard has become so predictable, so boring. I feel like I'm suffocating in this marriage. Scott makes me feel alive again, like I'm the woman I used to be. I know it's wrong, but I can't help myself. I need him." Richard's hands shook as he read the words. Each entry was a blow, a reminder of how far apart they had drifted. He felt a wave of nausea, his stomach churning with the realization of how deeply Rebecca had betrayed him. As he closed the journal, Richard's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He felt devastated, yet strangely relieved to finally have the truth laid bare before him. The evidence was irrefutable, and there was no denying the reality of Rebecca's infidelity. The man who had called him, mocking and arrogant, had been telling the truth. Richard stood up, his legs feeling weak. He looked around at the mess on the lawn, the scattered remnants of Rebecca's life with him. He knew that their marriage was over, that there was no going back from this. The trust had been shattered, and the love they once shared had been tainted beyond repair. Taking a deep breath, Richard began to gather the items from the lawn. He didn't want the neighbors to see this spectacle, this public display of his private pain. As he worked, his mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. He knew he had to confront Rebecca, to hear her side of the story, even though he already knew the truth. When he finished, he sat on the front steps, the bag at his feet. He felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The man he had been, the trusting husband, the contented partner, was gone. In his place was someone who had been forced to face a harsh and painful reality. Rebecca would be home soon, and Richard knew that the confrontation that awaited would be difficult. But he was ready. He had seen the truth, felt its sting, and now he needed to confront it head-on. The storm had arrived, and Richard was determined to face it, to find a way to move forward, even if it meant walking away from the life he had known. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, Richard steeled himself for the difficult conversation that lay ahead. The evidence of Rebecca's betrayal was undeniable, and there was no escaping the truth. The time had come to unravel the final threads of their marriage and face the consequences of Rebecca's choices. Richard sat on the front steps, the chaotic remnants of Rebecca's belongings still scattered across the lawn. The bag labeled, "For my lovely wife," sat at his feet, a grim reminder of the painful discoveries he had just made. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. There was one more item at the bottom of the bag that caught his attention, an antique locket. He gently pulled it out, feeling the weight of the small, ornate piece of jewelry in his hand. The locket was an heirloom, passed down through generations in his family. He hadn't seen it in years, and its presence here now struck him as both curious and significant. Opening it, he found a tiny key nestled inside. Richard's mind raced. He remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell about the locket. It was said to be the key to a hidden safe in their attic, a place where his family had stored important documents and treasures for decades. He had always thought it was just a legend, a tale to entertain the children, but now, with everything falling apart, it seemed worth investigating. Determined to find the truth, Richard stood up and made his way into the house. The familiar creak of the floorboards under his feet felt oddly comforting amidst the turmoil. He climbed the stairs to the attic, the small key clutched tightly in his hand. Pushing open the attic door, he was greeted by the smell of dust and old memories. The attic was filled with boxes of old photographs, holiday decorations, and forgotten relics of their lives. Richard made his way to the back, where he knew the safe was hidden. It took a few minutes of searching, but he finally found it, a small, inconspicuous metal box tucked behind a stack of old trunks. With trembling hands, Richard inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. He turned it slowly, hearing the satisfying click as the lock disengaged. Taking a deep breath, he opened the safe. Inside, Richard found a stack of neatly organized documents. He pulled them out, sitting down on an old wooden crate as he began to sift through them. What he found was astonishing. There were deeds to properties he had forgotten about, investments that had grown substantially over the years, and bank statements that revealed a level of wealth he hadn't fully realized. Richard's financial prudence and careful planning had paid off in ways he hadn't anticipated. There were certificates of stocks and bonds, each worth significant amounts. He found records of retirement accounts, savings plans, and a detailed ledger of expenses and income. As he reviewed each document, he felt a sense of validation and pride. Despite the personal betrayal he had endured, his efforts to secure their financial future had been successful. One document, in particular, caught his eye. It was a letter from his father, written years ago, providing guidance on managing the family's assets. The letter spoke of the importance of diligence, hard work, and integrity. Richard felt a lump in his throat as he read his father's words, a poignant reminder of the values that had shaped his life. As he sat there, surrounded by the tangible proof of his financial stability, Richard felt a shift within himself. The pain of Rebecca's betrayal was still raw, but the discovery of the hidden treasure brought a sense of empowerment. He realized that despite the turmoil in his personal life, he had the resources and the means to rebuild, to move forward. Richard carefully gathered the documents and placed them back in the safe. He locked it securely, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The financial stability he had uncovered gave him the confidence to face the challenges ahead. He knew that he could weather the storm, that he had the means to create a new future for himself. As he descended from the attic, Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The confrontation with Rebecca was still ahead, and it would undoubtedly be difficult. But he now knew that he was not defined by her betrayal. He had the strength, the resources, and the resilience to move forward. Back in the living room, Richard sat down and allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about the life he had built, the values he had upheld, and the future that still lay ahead of him. The discovery of the hidden treasure had reminded him of his own worth and capability. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke his reverie. Rebecca was home. Richard stood up, ready to face her with a newfound resolve. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but he was prepared. Armed with the truth and the knowledge of his own strength, he would confront the situation head-on and begin the process of rebuilding his life. As Rebecca entered the house, Richard looked at her, his expression calm but determined. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. "There's a lot we need to discuss, and it's time we faced it together." The confrontation was inevitable, but Richard felt ready. He had uncovered the hidden treasure, both in the attic and within himself. Now, it was time to navigate the next chapter of his life, with clarity and strength. Rebecca pulled into the driveway, her heart sinking at the sight of her belongings strewn across the lawn. Panic and confusion washed over her as she stepped out of the car, her mind racing. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that her secret affair with Scott couldn't stay hidden forever. But seeing the physical evidence of her impending confrontation with Richard was a shock. Richard stood at the top of the steps, a stoic figure amidst the chaos. He watched her approach, his eyes a mixture of sadness and determination. In his hand, he clutched the locket, the key to the hidden safe that had revealed the depth of Rebecca's betrayal. Rebecca's steps faltered as she met his gaze, her stomach twisting with guilt and fear. "Richard," she began, her voice trembling. "What's going on? Why is all my stuff out here?" Richard took a deep breath, steadying himself. "We need to talk, Rebecca." Inside. She followed him into the house, her heart pounding. The living room felt cold and unfamiliar, a far cry from the warm, inviting space it once was. Richard gestured for her to sit, and she complied, feeling the weight of the impending conversation pressing down on her. Richard remained standing, his eyes never leaving her face. "I got a call today," he said, his voice low but firm. "From Scott." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She tried to formulate a response, but the words wouldn't come. Richard continued, his tone steady but laced with pain. "He told me everything, Rebecca. About your affair. About how you handled him." He struggled to keep his voice even. "He called to mock me, to tell me that you're his property now." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to be so brutal, so raw. "Richard, Save it," Richard interrupted, holding up a hand. "I don't want to hear any excuses. I've spent the last few hours going through your things, trying to understand how this happened." He handed her the locket, the antique piece of jewelry feeling cold and heavy in her hands. "Do you remember this?" he asked. Rebecca nodded, her fingers trembling. "It's the locket that opens the safe in the attic," she whispered. "Yes," Richard replied. "And inside that safe, I found everything. The photographs, the love letters, your journal, everything." Rebecca's tears spilled over, running down her cheeks. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and deeply ashamed. "I'm so sorry, Richard," she sobbed. "I never meant to hurt you." Richard's expression softened for a moment, but the pain in his eyes was still there. "Rebecca, we've been married for over 30 years. I thought we had something real, something worth fighting for. But you threw it all away for a fling." Rebecca shook her head, desperate to explain. "It wasn't just a fling, Richard. I was unhappy. I felt like I was suffocating in our marriage. Scott made me feel alive again. And what about our life together?" Richard asked, his voice breaking. "What about the years we spent building this life, this home? Was that all meaningless to you?" "No," Rebecca cried. It wasn't meaningless, but I was lost, Richard. I didn't know how to talk to you, how to fix things. Scott was an escape. Richard's anger flared. An escape? You think that justifies betraying me? You think that excuses what you've done? Rebecca shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, it doesn't. I know it doesn't. I was wrong, Richard. I was selfish and stupid. And now I've lost everything. Richard took a deep breath, trying to contain his emotions. Scott's not here to save you, Rebecca. He called me to gloat, to mock me. But when he realized the extent of the mess he's caused, he abandoned you. He wants nothing to do with you now. Rebecca's heart sank. She had suspected that Scott's interest in her was more about the thrill of the affair than any real commitment. But hearing it from Richard, knowing that Scott had confirmed her worst fears, was devastating. So where does that leave us? Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. I don't know, Rebecca. I need time to think, to process all of this. Right now, I can't even look at you without feeling betrayed. Rebecca nodded, understanding the depth of his pain. I'll give you all the time you need, Richard. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right, to earn back your trust. Richard shook his head. I don't know if that's possible, Rebecca. Trust is something that's built over years, and you've shattered it in an instant. I need time to figure out if there's anything left worth salvaging. Rebecca watched as Richard walked away, leaving her alone in the living room. She felt a profound sense of loss, realizing that her actions had not only destroyed her marriage, but also the trust and love that had once defined their relationship. As she sat there, surrounded by the remnants of her life with Richard, Rebecca knew that the road to redemption would be long and difficult. She had betrayed the man she loved, and now she had to face the consequences. The confrontation had been brutal, but it was only the beginning of the journey ahead. The days following the confrontation were a blur for Rebecca. The once warm home now felt cold and empty, each room a painful reminder of the life she had shattered. She had moved her salvaged belongings into a small guest room, feeling more like a visitor than the woman who had once shared every corner of this house with Richard. Regret gnawed at her constantly, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. Everywhere Rebecca looked, she saw reminders of her betrayal. The family photos on the walls, the anniversary gifts displayed on shelves, the worn sofa where they had spent countless evenings together, all were now tainted with the memory of her infidelity. Scott was gone, having abandoned her the moment things became complicated. His departure left her feeling used and discarded, deepening her sense of isolation. Meanwhile, Richard's life took a different turn. The initial shock and devastation gradually gave way to a resolve to rebuild. He realized that he had spent too long in a marriage that had been crumbling without his knowledge. It was time to focus on himself, his passions, and the people who truly cared about him. Richard threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, finding solace in the structure and productivity it provided. He began to take on new projects, rediscovering the joy and satisfaction that came from his career. His colleagues noticed the change, commenting on his increased energy and determination. For the first time in years, Richard felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond his role as a husband. Outside of work, Richard reconnected with friends he had lost touch with over the years. He accepted invitations to social gatherings, joined a local book club, and even started attending a weekly poker game with some old college buddies. These interactions reminded him of the importance of companionship and the joy that came from sharing his life with others. Family became another pillar of Richard's new life. He spent more time with his children, who were now adults with their own lives. They rallied around him, offering support and encouragement as he navigated this difficult period. Richard also reached out to his siblings, rekindling relationships that had faded over time. The bonds of family provided him with a sense of stability and love that he desperately needed. As he surrounded himself with supportive friends and family, Richard also found time for his passions. He had always loved gardening, but had let it fall by the wayside in recent years. Now, he dedicated hours to transforming his backyard into a lush, vibrant sanctuary. The physical labor was therapeutic, and watching the garden flourish gave him a profound sense of accomplishment. Richard also picked up painting, a hobby he had enjoyed in his youth. He enrolled in an art class at the community center and spent evenings exploring his creativity. The act of creating something beautiful from a blank canvas was a metaphor for his own journey of rebuilding his life. While Richard thrived, Rebecca's world continued to unravel. She struggled with feelings of guilt and loneliness, her days marked by a profound sense of loss. She tried to reach out to friends, but many distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the knowledge of her betrayal. Her isolation grew, and she found herself yearning for the stability and love she had taken for granted. Rebecca attempted to find solace in her work, but her performance suffered. She couldn't concentrate, her mind constantly replaying the moments that had led to her downfall. Her colleagues noticed her distracted state, and the once friendly atmosphere at the office became strained and uncomfortable. Desperate to make amends, Rebecca sought counseling, hoping to understand the root of her actions and find a way to heal. The sessions were painful, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself and her choices. But they also offered a glimmer of hope, a path to redemption and self-awareness that she had never explored before. One evening, as Richard worked in his garden, Rebecca approached him, her heart heavy with remorse. "Richard, can we talk?" she asked, her voice trembling. Richard looked up, his expression guarded but calm. "What is it, Rebecca?" I want to apologize again," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I know I hurt you deeply, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I needed you to know that I'm truly sorry." Richard sighed, setting down his gardening tools. "Rebecca, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened. I appreciate your apology, but I need you to understand that forgiveness isn't something that comes easily. This has changed everything for me." "I understand," Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. "I just hope that one day you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Richard nodded slowly. "Maybe someday. But for now, I need to focus on myself and moving forward." As Rebecca walked away, Richard returned to his garden, the conversation a poignant reminder of the distance that now separated them. He knew that healing would take time, but he was determined to rebuild his life on his terms, rediscovering his self-worth and the joy of living authentically. Rebecca's journey, on the other hand, was just beginning. She had to face the consequences of her actions and find a way to rebuild her own life, learning from her mistakes and seeking a path to forgiveness and self-acceptance. The sun cast a golden glow over Richard's newly rejuvenated garden, its vibrant colors a testament to the man he had become. It was a reflection of his own transformation. Once broken and battered by betrayal, he had emerged stronger and more resilient. The garden, with its blooming flowers and meticulously tended rows, symbolized his journey of healing and renewal. Richard's newfound strength was evident in every aspect of his life. The once subdued man who had been left to pick up the pieces of a shattered marriage now stood tall, having reclaimed his dignity and carved out a new path forward. The scars of his past were still there, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of his resilience and growth. His professional life flourished as well. Richard's work had become a source of fulfillment rather than just a routine. He took on challenging projects that pushed him to innovate and excel. His colleagues and clients admired his dedication and passion, and his reputation as a capable and reliable professional grew. The sense of purpose he had rediscovered through his work added a new layer of satisfaction to his life. Richard's social circle expanded as he continued to nurture the relationships he had rekindled. His weekends were now filled with laughter and camaraderie, from poker nights with old friends to lively discussions at the book club. He found solace in these connections, the companionship and support providing a balm for the loneliness he had once felt. The local community took notice of Richard's transformation. He became involved in various charitable activities, using his skills and resources to contribute to causes he cared about. His efforts ranged from organizing fundraising events to volunteering at local shelters. The community welcomed him with open arms, and Richard's involvement was met with appreciation and respect. One of Richard's most significant achievements was the mentorship program he started for men facing similar challenges. Drawing from his own experiences, he offered guidance and support to those struggling with betrayal, loss, or personal crisis. His story became a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of resilience and the possibility of starting anew. Richard's speeches and workshops drew attention from local media, and he was featured in articles and interviews. He spoke candidly about his journey, sharing how he had navigated the tumultuous waters of betrayal and emerged stronger. His message resonated with many, particularly men in their 50s who found themselves at a crossroads, facing challenges in their personal or professional lives. Through these engagements, Richard became a source of inspiration for others. His candidness about his struggles and his unwavering resolve to rebuild his life were powerful reminders that even in the face of the deepest betrayal, one could rise above and find strength and resilience. His story was a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure and flourish despite adversity. One evening, Richard was invited to speak at a local event for men going through difficult times. As he stood on the stage, looking out at the audience, he felt a profound sense of purpose. He shared his journey, the pain of betrayal, the process of rebuilding, and the lessons he had learned. His words were met with a standing ovation, and he could see the impact of his story on the faces before him. After the event, several men approached Richard, expressing their gratitude and admiration. They shared their own struggles and sought his advice. Richard listened with empathy and offered guidance, sharing the tools and strategies that had helped him through his own challenges. The connections he made that night reinforced his belief in the power of community and support. As the months passed, Richard continued to build on his newfound sense of purpose. He maintained his connections with friends and family, celebrated milestones, and pursued new passions. The once painful memories of his past had transformed into sources of strength and insight. One day, while walking through his garden, Richard paused to admire the blooming roses, their petals glistening in the sunlight. He felt a profound sense of peace and accomplishment. The garden, once a symbol of his personal struggles, had become a thriving testament to his resilience. Richard knew that his journey was far from over, but he faced the future with a renewed sense of optimism and determination. The trials he had endured had forged a new path for him, one marked by strength, purpose, and hope. His story was no longer just a tale of betrayal, but a narrative of triumph and rebirth. In sharing his journey with others, Richard had found a deeper meaning in his experiences. He had transformed his pain into a powerful message of hope, inspiring others to rise from their own ashes and find strength in their resilience. As he looked to the future, Richard knew that he would continue to embrace life with courage and grace, knowing that even in the face of the deepest betrayal, one could always rise above and forge a new path forward.